Can politics make sense without the concept of enemy? The question may sound cynical. For decades, we have told ourselves that humanity is on a course toward mutual understanding and universal peace. Yet, the war on Europe's doorstep in Ukraine and the violence spreading across the Middle East remind us of the persistence of war. When war breaks out, humanitarian and pacifist pledges count for little. The very moment someone calls you an enemy, you have an enemy, whether you want it or not. So perhaps we must face this reality. The world is full of potential enemies, and only by admitting this can we act responsibly in politics. That is the journey I want to take you on today, guided by one of the 20th century most provocative thinkers, Carl Schmitt. But who then was Carl Schmitt? Born in 1888 in the Westphalian town of Plettenberg in Germany, Schmitt lived almost a full century and died in 1985. He was a lawyer and a philosopher. I will not unpack that episode here because that's out of the subject, but I should mention that he joined the National Socialist Party in 1933, a decision that has made him one of modernity's most controversial thinkers, a bit like Martin Heidegger, another German philosopher. Yet, despite this controversy, I consider Carl Schmitt, and I'm not the only one, to be one of the greatest political thinkers of the modern era, combining both a vast classical culture and an acute awareness of contemporary problems. Even though he was German, Schmitt thought with a Latin mind. His way of thinking can be linked with the realism of Machiavelli, Jean Bodin, and Thomas Hobbes, but also with the counter-revolutionary thinkers like Joseph de Maistre, Louis Bonald, or Juan Donoso Cortés. In my roots, I am Roman, juridically and by tradition, he once answered. Carl Schmitt is a fascinating thinker, but not an easy author to read. His writing is dense, allusive, and packed with historical references. Carl Schmitt often assumes that the readers already know the political canon. So, to make his key ideas more accessible, I will concentrate on a little book called The Concept of the Political, in German Der Begriff des Politischen, first published in 1927 and expanded in 1932, where almost all of his later themes first appear. So think of it as the best entry point to Carl Schmitt. I will obviously not try to cover everything. Instead, I will focus on the heart of the text, which is Schmitt's definition of the politics as the power to distinguish friend from enemy. So, what puzzle is Schmitt trying to solve in this book? On the surface, he is wrestling with a very abstract idea, but underneath, the stakes are enormous. His goal is to isolate the single criterion that tells us whether an issue is purely political or not. Take a few seconds to reflect on this yourself. We use that word all the time. It's political. But by what criteria? On what do we base that judgment? Might the matter be moral instead? Or perhaps economical? What lets us know for sure that this is a political matter? A very common mistake or abuse in Schmitt's time, and surely still widespread today, is to conflate the political with the state. In one way or another, the concept of political is generally glued to the concept of state, or at least is brought into relation with it. The state thus appears as something political, and the political as something pertaining to the state, which produces a vicious circle in which each notion merely explains the other. But Schmitt breaks the circle in the very sentence of his book. The concept of the state presupposes the concept of the political. To translate this into simple language, politics can exist outside, even beyond the state. Even if the state disappeared, politics would still exist. As long as humans share a common life, they must organize it. And that activity is politics, and it would continue even if the state collapsed tomorrow. The modern state is simply one historical vessel for political organization, destined to mutate or die like any other institution. As a consequence, it is impossible to imagine a society that is not politically organized, yet perfectly possible to imagine such organization taking a non-statist form. Politics without the state is perfectly imaginable, but a state without politics is not. For Schmitt, politics is a basic substance of collective life. The state, however, is only an instance, a contingent shell of sovereignty that may wither or depoliticize while the political impulse endures. But now to the heart of the matter. What single test tells us whether an issue is political or not? What is that famous criterion I was talking about? For Schmitt, this criterion is the famous and the strong antithesis of friend and enemy. To understand it, Schmitt insists that we strip away all moral, aesthetic, and economic lenses. Each sphere of human life has its own rationality, and Schmitt, as I said, is looking for a criteria specific to the political realm. Each sphere has its own concepts and relatively autonomous distinctions. Morality, for instance, rests on the concepts of good and evil. Aesthetics on the concepts of beautiful and ugly. Economics on the profitable and the non-profitable. The question then is whether there is also a special distinction which can serve as a simple criterion of the political and of what it consists. Schmitt's answer is this one. The specific distinction of the political, to which political acts and motives can be reduced, is precisely the discrimination between friend and enemy. The political begins the moment a group can say, these are our friends, those are our enemies. This distinction is autonomous, for it cannot be translated into the earlier pairs of concepts I mentioned. What is good, for instance, is not necessarily beautiful nor profitable. Well, the political enemy may be wicked, hideous, or bankrupt, or none of this actually. An enemy might have very deep moral insights, just not the same as yours, and you might even trade with him if it pays. What matters is that in the final instance, the two camps can confront one another as public enemies. Of course, states often depict enemies as evil or grotesque because such broad labels make mobilization easier. But that propaganda does not erase the logical independence of the friend-enemy distinction. Morally bad actors are not always political enemies, and political enemies are not always moral monsters. So, if Schmitt isolates the opposition so cleanly, it is precisely to prove his point. Politics has its own irreducible logic, one that will outlive any particular state, ideology, or market. But friend and enemy are not poetic ornaments. They are concrete roles. Calling someone an enemy means accepting the possibility of a fight, not a simple quarrel between friends or on Twitter or some economical rivalry, but in the last resort, a fight to the death. As Schmitt puts it, the friend, enemy, and combat concepts receive their real meaning precisely because they refer to the real possibility of physical killing. War follows from enmity. War is the existential negation of the enemy. It is the most extreme consequence of enmity. It does not have to be common, normal, something ideal or desirable, but it must nevertheless remain a real possibility for as long as the concept of the enemy remains valid. As he says, this does not mean that war is common or normal, nor that it is in any way ideal or desirable. But the idea of war must remain present, necessarily, as a real possibility if the notion of enemy is to make any sense. Political activity is therefore defined by Schmitt as the product of a polarization centered on the relation of hostility and the possibility of war. But again, recognizing the permanent danger of war does not make Schmitt a warmonger. Sometimes the wisest political move is precisely to avoid the war. War is not politics' goal. It is the limiting case that silently shapes every serious political calculation. So, every nation, or to be more precise, every political entity, is in fact politically organized and rallies around this friend-enemy opposition. But to understand what is meant by enemy, further distinctions are needed again. The enemy is not an annoying competitor, nor a personal rival we hate because we feel some kind of antipathy toward him. No, the political enemy can only be a public enemy. That means one organized group that could, if pushed to a certain point, meet another organized group on the battlefield. To illustrate the difference between a public and a private enemy, Carl Schmitt invokes this well-known saying of Christ, "Love your enemies," a saying that creates a lot of confusions nowadays. Carl Schmitt points out that modern European languages conflate every opponent into one word. In German, for example, we simply say Feind. In French, ennemi. In English, there is enemy or foe, but they don't really have a different meaning. They imply more stylistic differences. Greek and Latin, however, had at least two different words to describe the private enemy and the public enemy. Inimicus in Latin or echthros in Greek meant the personal enemy, the person you dislike in your private life. Hostis and polemios, on the contrary, meant the public enemy, the political enemy who wants to destroy you or enslave your people. Now, coming back to the saying of Christ, the Greek original says agapate tous echthros humon, or in the Latin translation, diligite inimicos vestros. In this verse, Christ gives then a moral command, not a political one. It tells you to forgive the neighbor who wronged you, to not fall into what Nietzsche would call resentment, and even wish him a return to the good. But it doesn't tell you, of course, to surrender your city if an invading army shows up. And that is why, as Schmitt says, during the struggle between Christianity and Islam from the Middle Ages to the 18th century, no Christian ever imagined, out of love for the Turks, delivering Europe over to Islam instead of defending it. Medieval Christians could fight the Ottomans without betraying the commands of Christ. Love your enemy only applies in the moral sphere, but it certainly does not mean that we must love the enemies of our own people and help them against it. From this, Carl Schmitt extracts a hard rule. Politics lives on the possibility of conflict. From a political perspective, the Earth is not a universe, but a pluriverse. It is not a single happy family. Every political unit exists alongside others, and therefore alongside at least one potential enemy. Utopians dream of switching off that logic, turning states into sheer management machines devoted to individual bliss. Schmitt thinks the dream backfires, and it is easy to understand why. A nation that declares it has no enemies disarms itself and by default helps the enemy. It is foolish to believe that a defenseless people would have only friends. Peace offers cannot stop another people from choosing war. If that happens, you either resist or perish. Thus, says Carl Schmitt, if a people no longer possesses the energy or the will to maintain itself in the sphere of politics, the latter will not thereby vanish from the world, only a weak people will disappear. Refusing to play politics does not end politics. it only ends the people who make that refusal. And that is the first paradox to which the misunderstanding or the refusal of politics can lead. But there is a second paradox, an inverse effect produced by pacifism and by a purely humanitarian outlook that would like to end conflict for the sake of lofty universal values. Pacifists often accuse Carl Schmitt of glorifying conflict, but he flips the charge. It is only by admitting that peoples may fight that we can limit cruelty, because only then can we respect our adversary as legitimate. Universalist ideologies do the exact opposite. The moment someone claims to speak for all mankind, his opponents become outside mankind. They become simple criminals to be erased. And that is why Carl Schmitt refers to the quote of the French Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, qui dit humanité veut tromper. Whoever says humanity is trying to fool you. Wars waged for humanity's sake quickly slide into moral crusades. The enemy is painted as a monster who must be annihilated, not merely defeated. The enemy is not simply defending his interests, he is an inhuman monster who should be destroyed. Sweet-sounding humanitarianism, in fact, borders on the bloodiest fanaticism. Schmitt's tougher realism that accepts the enemy's right to exist and the possibility of war, paradoxically, cools tempers. When I know that my enemy is a public hostis, similar to myself, and not a devil to exterminate, I can fight, I can bargain, or even back down without demanding his moral destruction. Fewer illusions and fewer holy wars. That is why, Schmitt says, and I shall end on this point, politics rests on what he calls anthropological pessimism. This is a necessary premise of politics. By anthropological pessimism, it simply means that humans are not spontaneously good. Their desires easily drift toward harm or evil unless something stops them. Instinct, passion, animality, these are the raw materials of our species. However, this is not a dogma about what humanity is in every sense. It is a working assumption suited to the political craft, just as other spheres of reality adopt their own. A teacher, for instance, must presume that children are educable, otherwise, why teach them? A Catholic theologian must presume humans sin, or why preach redemption? The statesman, says Carl Schmitt, must presume conflict. If politics forget that enemies can appear, it gets moralized, neutralized, and replaced by bland management. And morality itself collapses in the end because no one is left to defend the community that gives moral rules their force. This book, The Concept of the Political, contains, of course, far more that I could fit into one video, but I hope that these core ideas will already help you understand both Carl Schmitt and the nature of political with sharper eyes. We swim today in what Arnold Gehlen used to call hypermorality. Everything is dropped into moral slogan, and the line between ethics and politics blurs. But to my opinion, Schmitt's realism cuts through that fog. And by viewing politics as it is, we are less likely to be fooled by simplistic and moralizing rhetoric. That is why I wanted to offer you this video today. If you would like to go further, I am also the author of this short introductory book, Political Realism, which has been translated into English by Arctos. In this book, I try to set out the principles on which all political practice rests, drawing especially on three thinkers, Machiavelli, Thomas Hobbes, and Carl Schmitt. I will put a link in the video description should you wish to obtain it. A quick personal note to finish. This is my first video in English. I already run a French language channel on political philosophy, on which I explore a wide range of thinkers, Carl Schmitt of course, but also Tocqueville, Joseph de Maistre, Nietzsche, Guillaume Fay, Dominique Venner, José Ortega y Gasset, Arnold Galen, and many others. I will also put a link in the video description in case you would like to have a look. All those episodes on my main channel are in French because I'm a French-speaking Belgian. But I've decided to translate some of these episodes into English so that these ideas can reach a broader audience. But English isn't my native tongue, as you may hear, so please let me know in the comments if you spot anything that I could improve, pronunciation tips, phrasing, whatever helps, or even comments concerning the content itself. I'm very open to all kinds of advices. Thanks for watching. If you found any value here, please give the video a like, it really helps new viewers find us, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss the next episodes. Hope to see you soon.